بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه. Welcome to another session on our series on understanding the pandemic crisis through the framework of Maqasid Sharia. Today we have with us Dr. Nazir Khan. Dr. Nazir Khan is a radiologist. He is also the president of Yaqeen Canada and the director of the research strategy at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He's a neuroradiologist, as mentioned. He's an assistant professor at McMaster University. Dr. Khan completed his residency at the University of Manitoba and a fellowship in diagnostic neuroradiology right here with us at University of Calgary. His expertise in both medical science and Islamic theology uniquely position him to address challenging contemporary questions regarding faith, reason, and science. He has also served as an imam for many years and has memorized the Quran, alhamdulillah, and he has taught Quranic studies, classes, workshops, and seminars. Dr. Khan used to deliver for us when he was with us here in Calgary at the khutbah. We used to take turn in giving khutbah at the Foothill Medical Center. And today, Dr. Khan will be talking about an important concept of maqasid having to do with the interaction of the text or scripture and the benefit. And there are many questions that comes when we think of this subject. Now, just to put this in context, to remind everybody what we're doing here is in this series of maqasid, we say the maqasid or the objective of Sharia are all about seeking the benefit of the maslaha. And when we talked about maslaha, and we had many sessions on this, we defined the maslaha. We talked about the levels of maslaha, as you see here in the bottom of this chart. We talked about balancing the interest and the harm. Dr. Yasser Ghannam spoke about that. Last week, we have Brother Suhaib Ramzan from UK speaking about closing the means and al-ma'alat or consequences. And today, highlighted in green, we're going to talk about al-maslaha and the text and how they interact with each other. And with this topic, many questions come to mind. Can either of them, there is the text or the benefit or the maslaha, be ignored? Can any of them be limiting or specifying to the other? Can we rely only on the wording and expressions of the text, or should we be more focused on the objectives, the meaning, and interpretation? Should we consider only the text or only the objective, or both? Does benefit come ahead of text in any way? What are the classical and modern opinion on these issues? And those are some of the questions that come to mind. And without further ado, I'll let Brother Nazir to take us in a journey on this important and relevant subject in maqasid. Brother Khan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Nuruddin, and also Brother Muhammad bin Yamani for inviting me to speak on this subject, and also for putting together such an amazing program under the Horizon Academy Institute. Mashallah, I've had the chance to see some of the previous sessions, and the curriculum is really outstanding. And there's very little need for me to comment on what the scholars have mentioned previously, but mashallah, amazing work has been done. And I also want to thank Dr. Nuruddin and Brother Muhammad for providing some of the material that I'm going to be sharing with you in today's session. And inshallah ta'ala, we can benefit from one another in the discussion and learn from each other. So what I share today about the subject of maslaha and text, inshallah ta'ala, are some useful points for all of us to reflect on, and to some of it may be a refresher of some of the points that have been discussed previously, and some of it may be new insights as well. So I want to start by kind of taking us back and, going back to a point that has been mentioned throughout this series, and that is that we see, numerous scholars from the Islamic tradition emphasizing the fact that maslaha is part of our religion, right? With different quotes, statements like, the entire Sharia is rahmatum kulliha wa adlun kulliha, that it is mercy in its entirety, it is justice in its entirety. Statements like the Sharia has come for jalb al-masalih wa dar al-mafasid, right? That the entire religion, the Islamic law has come for the purpose of obtaining the benefits, the things that are in the interest of the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to repel any things that are of harm. So we know that this is a fundamental message of the deen. Now, it's interesting, Sheikh Ahmed Raisuni makes an interesting point. When we talk about what do we do when we have something that we think this is a benefit, right? This is clearly something that is beneficial for us, it's something we should do, or this is something that is clearly harmful for us, it's something we should stay away from. And then we have a statement in scripture that seems to contradict that. What's going on there, right? When we have this apparent contradiction, I'm going to say apparent contradiction because we're going to unpackage that a little bit further. But we have this apparent contradiction between the perceived benefit and between what the religion is telling us, the instruction coming from the religion. How do we understand that? And one of the points that he mentions is that this is similar to a discussion that the Muslim theologians spent a lot of time on, which is the discussion about the relationship between al-aql, the human intellect, and naql, right? The transmitted text, the transmitted text in scripture. In fact, he mentions it's a branch of it. And why is that? Well, when we say that something is a benefit or a harm, we're using human reasoning to identify that. We're using our human reasoning to be able to identify that. And in fact, some people would add that in today's time we can do, rather than just doing, armchair philosophizing about what is benefit or harm, we can actually extend what human reason can actually accomplish. So people would point out that we can do, psychological experiments and see which approach to a particular topic, which can actually bring about greater happiness for people, which can actually reduce pain and suffering, which actually has more benefits for a person's health and well-being. We can do economic studies on which measures in society will bring about greater prosperity. So if we use our aql and these different tools of the aql, the different intellectual tools to identify things that are of benefit and harm, how do we factor that into our understanding of the Sharia, which also tells us certain instructions and do's and don'ts? So we have certain things that we've identified based on the aql, this is beneficial, this is harmful, and we have things that we've identified based on the naql, based on the scripture, this is beneficial and this is harmful. How does this all come about? And it's also related to another question that the scholars of theology talked about, and that's the question of tahseen and taqbih. Tahseen is when you declare that something is hasan or good. And taqbih is you're declaring that something is qabih or bad or blameworthy, something despicable. So your ability to identify something as morally good and worth pursuing, and your ability to identify something as morally bad and worth avoiding, is that something that the aql can actually do? So in order to answer that question, we're going to go to an interesting dilemma that was known to ancient philosophers. Even before the Muslim theologians discussed this issue, there was an ancient problem that people talked about, and that's called Euthyphro's dilemma. So I want to briefly explain this because it's actually an interesting problem that provides some context for us when we're thinking about these issues. So what is Euthyphro's dilemma? So Plato, in his stories about Socrates, he mentions a story where Socrates is on his way to the courthouse. And at the courthouse, he happens to encounter a man by the name of Euthyphro. And Euthyphro, he asks him, why are you going to the court? What's your business there? And Euthyphro says, well, I'm going there because I'm going to prosecute my father. Euthyphro says that he wants to bring charges against his father. And there's a whole backstory to that, which is that Euthyphro's father actually punished one of his workers because that worker slayed one of his slaves. He killed one of his slaves, and Euthyphro's father punished that worker as a result of it. He tied him, he threw him into a ditch, and that worker died. And so Euthyphro is going to the courthouse to charge his father with murder. So this is a very interesting moral question for Socrates, and he says, is this something that you're doing? Is it good or is it bad to charge your father with murder, right? And so, it's a very interesting kind of odd backstory to it, but just focus on this question that Socrates then asks. He says, he asks Euthyphro because he says, if you're so sure that what you're doing is right, how do you know what you're doing is right? And he says, and Euthyphro says, he's one of the ancient Greeks, so he says it's because it's pleasing to the gods. So Socrates asks him, is it pleasing to the gods because it is good, or is it good because the gods like it? So the question that people talk about with Euthyphro's dilemma is the question of, is something good because God commanded it, or did God command it because it was good? In other words, the dilemma seems to present two options that both seem unsatisfactory, right? On the one hand, you have the idea that that it was just it's only good because God commanded it, and therefore it seems arbitrary, right? It doesn't seem like there's anything in and of itself that's good. And on the other hand, there's the other option, which is that something is intrinsically good, but then it seems to limit the power of God. That God is his actions are caused because there's already something that's good, so he has to command what is good. So it's very interesting dilemma that's posed. And actually, the Muslim theologians discussed this, and they had very interesting solutions to this. And first, I should mention that we're going to go into this in more detail later in the presentation. But to give you a background, the Muslim theologians, they were familiar with Greek philosophy, right? And that's where the discussion of ilm al-kalam came up, where they started to debate and discuss these different ideas. So you had a group called the Mu'tazila that said that reason determines what is good and what is bad. That the aql has the power to do tahsin wa taqbih, to determine what is good and what is bad. Then you had the another group, the Ash'ari, who said that reason it does not have the capacity to determine what is good and what is bad. Rather, it is revelation that determines what is good and what is bad. And that's called divine command theory. Then you have the Maturidiyya, which is another group within Kalam, which said that reason can be a tool to know what is good and what is bad, but ultimately it's determined by God's commandments. So they took a middle position where they said, basically, ontologically, in terms of what's actually existing out there, God's commandments determine what is good and what is bad. But epistemologically, in terms of what we can know, reason can be used because God has made it a tool to know what is good and what is bad. Then you have the athari approach, which is to mention that there are some things that we know that are good and bad just from the fitrah. Right? Every human child knows that justice is good and injustice is bad. Every human child knows that compassion is good and cruelty is bad. There's some things we know from the fitrah, but there's a more advanced level of morality that requires divine revelation for guidance. And there's different variations of these positions, but the Muslim scholars discuss this in a lot of detail. Now, this question about how you know what is good and what is bad, it also relates to this topic of masalih and mafasid. Because what role are we going to give to the aql and to the fitrah in determining what is good and what is bad? If we say that something is this thing that we think is good because of some kind of materialistic benefit, or is it because it completely contradicts every notion that the fitrah has about mercy and justice and this kind of sensibility? What level are we actually going to give that epistemic authority, that level of knowledge to the aql to understand what is good and what is bad? There's a level at which, as every Muslim theologian would say, that there's an understanding where Allah, you have to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine wisdom. But there's also a level at which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the capacity to understand certain things. So there's that dynamic there as well in the Islamic teachings. Now, when we talk about, practical examples, how is this just a very theoretical subject of masalih and mafasid, or does it have real life tangible examples? This is actually, the one topic in the series, that I think Dr. Nuruddin gave me the most controversial topic. And it's a topic, but we're here to talk about the principles to understand, right? We're not here to talk about yes or no for this or that. We want to talk about the principles and give people the tools to actually understand these issues. So if you look at what are some of the common controversies that people are debating out there in the Muslim community and social media, in the homes, in public spaces, often you'll find the controversies are revolving around questions about masalih and mafasid and justifying that in relation to certain scriptural instructions. And how do we balance between the two? And here are a list of questions that we can consider as examples. And by the way, these questions, I'm making no judgment about the validity or invalidity of these questions. I picked a broad range of questions just to give you an understanding of the range of answers there, of what people are saying. Sometimes people go to an extreme in affirming what they think are masalih and actually negating what is scriptural guidance. And sometimes people go to an extreme in what they think is the correct interpretation of the scripture and actually negating what is legitimate masalih and are based on divine guidance. And so people go to different extremes. And then there are other issues that are gray areas that really require scholarly insight and reflection and weighing the pros and cons and evaluating the evidences carefully. So look at these examples, the idea of, can we use music concerts as a means to fundraise to help those in poverty? There's a clear maslaha of helping people in poverty. And if this is the means that is bringing the most amount of money, can we actually use that? Or are we going against what is a majority opinion to consensus opinion about the use of musical instruments and other things associated with concerts? Where do we draw the line? Can we permit people to buy homes using interest-based loans, interest mortgages, because we say that overall home ownership is leading to community growth? Or is this going too far? Where do we draw the line? A question related to the pandemic this is a question we've seen and it's been discussed in great detail, but the idea of holding prayers, avoid holding prayers in congregation, suspending holding prayers in congregation because of the mafasid, the dangers associated with the spread of the viral infection. And other questions may be more medically based, right? If you have a fetus that's diagnosed with severe malformative abnormalities that preclude this fetus from having a normal life as a baby, as an infant, and basically give you medical certainty that this is not going to develop into a healthy child, can you abort that fetus earlier, and so you avoid that suffering and difficulty and hardship? What do you do in that kind of situation, or is that going too far? What about, people have this common question, what about attending gatherings with colleagues from business or students from school or from university, and at the gathering, there's alcohol being served, but avoiding the gathering results in, different types of hardships related to one's business work or one's educational opportunities. Where does one draw a balance there? Different discussions about people talking about, we have clear texts about the inheritance law, right? Those are mentioned in the Quran. And what people raising questions about, is there some flexibility when there's a situation where a woman is not being financially provided for? What do we do about the shares? Or are there other means within the Sharia to compensate for that? So these are, just a bunch of questions just to get you thinking about some of the questions that are out there. Again, I'm not making any statement about the type of answer for any of these questions, but just to trigger some thoughts about the kinds of questions that are there. So we have in our minds, in the back of our minds, the need to have a principled approach when we think about these questions. So we don't go to one extreme or the other, but we have an answer that is well grounded in reverence for the scripture, firmly grounded in the texts and teachings of the Quran and Sunnah, at the same time understanding based on the scriptures, the importance the scripture gives to masalih and mafasid, understanding the importance of taking into consideration benefits and harms. And what we mentioned at the beginning, there are many quotes about this, and just to reiterate just a couple of these, Al-Izz ibn Abdus Salam, one of the famous Muslim jurists, he mentions this point. Islamic law is entirely about advocating humanity's best benefits by warding off harm and bringing benefit. So this is something that is mentioned in the works of jurisprudence. It is something that Ash-Shatibi mentions in Al-Muwafaqat, that for an Islamic opinion, must necessarily entail mercy, compassion, and for any opinion that entails the opposite of that, it's something that goes outside of the boundaries of Islamic law. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he mentions in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in this famous quote that I'm sure has been mentioned before, but the quote about the Sharia is founded upon wisdom and the well-being of humanity in this life and the next, and it is in its entirety justice, compassion, prosperity, and wisdom. Therefore, anything which departs from justice to injustice, from compassion to its opposite, from welfare to harm, or from wisdom to nonsense, then it is not part of the Sharia, even if it is included therein by misinterpretation. So when you look at these quotes, you realize the seriousness of taking into consideration masalih and mafasid, right? And you realize it's not, when we're answering questions like this, it's not something we can just take lightly and say, oh, here's a text from the Quran and Sunnah that says this, and therefore this is the fatwa. No, first of all, we are not in the position to be giving the fatwa. It should be qualified scholars who look at the masalih and mafasid and look at the text of the Quran and Sunnah, and they look at the contemporary context. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah says that if somebody gives fatwa based just on what they find in the books, then their crime upon the Sharia is greater than the crime of a doctor who tries to treat everyone based on what he finds in the books from Galen, from Hippocrates, without any consideration of a person's physiological condition and people's individual differences. That the doctor who results in the patient's deaths because of his ignorance of how each patient is different, the crime of the scholar, giving fatwa from the books without any consideration of the context is like that, right? There's the incredible danger to somebody being an ignorant doctor and to somebody being an ignorant scholar. So there's this important understanding there. And another way we can see that is when we look at the fact that some of the scholars, they use the term fiqh differently from the term sharia to make this distinction that sharia are the nusus. They are those texts. So when we talk about maslaha versus nas, right, you can say sharia refers to the texts from the Quran and the Sunnah, the nusus, but fiqh refers to the understanding, the human understanding that we derive from those texts. Right? And so there are certain things in the text that are clear-cut, they're qat'i, right? They're definitive. You read it and there's no room for other interpretations, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا إِلَهُكُمْ وَاحِدٌ, right? إِنَّمَا إِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ, that verily your Lord is one Lord, your God is one God, right? There's no room for other interpretations, ikhtilaf, nothing, right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the rulings about the fundamentals of salah and zakat and hajj and siyam, there are fundamentals that are not open to different opinions. They're not subject to interpretation, but there are other details related to the ibadat and lots of details related to mu'amalat that require the exercise of human understanding and interpretation in deriving the rulings from the texts. And so part of that human understanding, part of the fiqh, is to take into consideration the masalih and the mafasid. So we're already seeing one of the answers to that initial question about maslaha versus nas, we see why it's not a juxtaposition of maslaha versus nas, because the nusus of the Sharia are understood in fiqh with consideration of the masalih and the mafasid, right? So the text forms the initial layer, and then the understanding of bringing into consideration the masalih and the mafasid allows us to understand how to implement those and apply them to different situations. And we see that scholars took into consideration the situation, and they mentioned that that's part of what fiqh is. So if you look at this quote from Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, and as you know, Sufyan al-Thawri, he is one of the early scholars of Islam who had his own madhab, actually. At the time when you had the other, four imams, Imam Abu Hanifa, who died 150 Hijri, Imam Malik died 179 Hijri. In a contemporary of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, you had Sufyan al-Thawri, who died 181 Hijri. And he said, verily, fiqh, according to us, is when a trustworthy scholar provides a rukhsa, for the people. He provides a legitimate concession. He takes into account what the people need. As for being strict, tashdid, then anyone can do that. Right? You don't need fiqh to do that. So there's an understanding right from the earliest period of Islam that the alim looks at the nusus and he takes into consideration what actually is beneficial for the people in showing them how to apply those nusus. And what is a rukhsa? A rukhsa is when the instruction in the nusus, the azima, the normal rule that generally applies, you show people what are the exceptional circumstances in which you have a dispensation, you have a license to do something, to take a lighter load, because that you have a unique circumstance in which that general instruction doesn't apply to you. So that is taking into consideration what? Masalih and mafasid in providing the rukhsa, and that's part of the understanding of fiqh. So and this is something that I discuss in more detail in an article on Yaqeen Institute called Difference of Opinion. Where do we draw the line? Difference of opinion, where do we draw the line? So these are some of the quotes from that article. Another quote from that article, that we talk about is the fact that the person providing this rukhsa has to be a person of ilm, because just like Imam Sufyan al-Thawri said that tashdid, anyone can do that, right? Being strict, anyone can do that. At the same time also, if you leave the awam, the lay people to just follow what they think is masalih and mafasid, it ends up being ittiba'ul hawa, right? It ends up being following their desires. And so there's a need for scholars with proper knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah, with proper knowledge of the tools of usul al-fiqh, right? The tools of Islamic jurisprudence to actually perform ijtihad. So whose ijtihad are we talking about? The ijtihad of qualified scholars. And one of the things that's interesting is that we understand the need for expertise when it comes for other subjects, right? If somebody wants to be a physician, they have to write their examinations, right? They have to write an exam after medical school, they have to write an exam after residency, and then they receive their certification, their from the Royal College, and they receive their license from the Provincial College of Physicians and Surgeons. So there's this idea of regulation, and actually the scholars of Islam classically, they discuss similar concepts. So of the concepts that's mentioned is the idea that scholars would be tested by their peers. So there's a narration which mentions that Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib radhiyallahu anh, he passed by Hassan al-Basri, and there's a narration mentioning that that there's a possibility Hassan al-Basri did meet Ali ibn Abi Talib. So it mentions this narration that Ali radiallahu anh, he saw Hassan al-Basri lecturing in his circle. And Ali radiallahu anh interrupted the session to give him a quiz. And he started asking him, do you know this ruling, this matter? He asked him a few questions. And when Hassan al-Basri answered the question successfully, then Ali radiallahu anh said, you may continue to lecture now as you please. Okay, so just the general idea that there is an idea of having expertise, being qualified, even to the extent of potentially being examined by one's peers to ensure that one has the requisite knowledge. And that learning in Islamic studies has to encompass so many different fields, right? The Arabic language, Hadith sciences, Islamic theology, Islamic jurisprudence. These are different subjects that a person needs to have intensively studied in order to provide sound knowledge and guidance. Unfortunately, if somebody thinks that they just study they've excelled in their own field, which maybe have nothing to do with religious studies, maybe it's in the natural sciences or the humanities, and they feel that then gives them the ability to pronounce judgments on these different things, they're going to cause a lot of damage because they're not going to understand the nuances of the methodology of Islamic legal theory. So it's important to recognize that when we talk about maslaha, maslaha does not mean following desires, following a person's individual lusts, or it doesn't mean just doing whatever is politically expedient, or it doesn't mean just capitulating to the dominant ideology of the time, whether it's secular humanism, Western liberalism, whatever the latest ism is. That's not what maslaha is, right? Maslaha doesn't mean, okay, the culture around us, they like this, so we want to make our deen similar to that. No. And this is one of the things that, this is a quote from the article that I mentioned. It's important to remember that our yardstick in assessing benefit or harm is not the yardstick handed to us by secular humanism, hedonistic materialism, or Western liberalism. Rather, masalih and mafasid, benefit and harm, must be assessed according to the value structure that Islam gives us, which puts human beings in a unique role. What is that role? It puts human beings in this role of being custodians on this earth, assigned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be custodians on this earth. Imam Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi, rahimahullah, he mentioned that this role of khilafah that the human being has on this earth means that we are entrusted with this duty to ensure the implementation of these maqasid, the maqasid of the sharia on this earth. So when we talk about what is maslaha, it's not going to be something like, oh, well, this makes me more money, and so because it makes me more money, I'm going to say that this is the maslaha, and that's why I'm going to do this. No, it has to be something that is a value based on with the guidance from Islam. It has to be something that ultimately directs human beings back to their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and betters their ability to take care of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Values that are actually grounded in the Sharia. And we're going to talk about a framework for understanding that at the end of the presentation when we conclude as well, inshallah. So this is, some of the points that scholars have mentioned as the dawabit of the maslaha, or the regulating factors that determine what exactly we consider a maslaha to begin with. It's not going to be just something that increases materialistic wealth or physical pleasure, but it has to be ultimately something that is tied to the spiritual prosperity of human beings as well. So when we look at the topic of masalih and mafasid, we have an amazing methodology that has been laid out by scholars of Islam. And as Sheikh Ahmed Raisuni, Dr. Raisuni quotes Imam al-Shatibi mentioning that we should follow the methodology of the well-known and knowledgeable Imams in how they assessed masalih and mafasid, right? And putting things in the correct perspective. So we understand that when we talk about the tradition, we're building on the insights of our scholars and our predecessors. We're building on what the foundations that these scholars have laid down, where it's not a matter of somebody coming along and trying to reinvent something new. The guidance of Islam is clear. Now, when we talk about masalih and mafasid and talk about what some of the classical scholars have mentioned, one of the scholars whose name comes up a lot, and who's often blamed actually for having an incorrect view is Najmuddin al-Tufi. Najmuddin al-Tufi, the Hanbali scholar, who it's often alleged that he has the viewpoint that masalih can override texts of scripture, that if you see something that is maslaha, and he's speaking only about mu'amalat and adat, the idea is that the maslaha, the allegation is that he mentions that maslaha overrides scripture, and this is commonly mentioned. But it's interesting also that Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi mentions this may actually be a misreading of what Al-Tufi was actually suggesting, which when you look at what he says, it's actually about what is qat'i. So when a text is qat'i, then he mentions that's it. There's no question about anything overriding that. When it's definitive, there's no question about anything overriding that. The issue is what happens when the text is dhanni, right? When it's open to interpretation, when it's subject to different interpretation, then the scholar factors into their understanding what are the masalih and the mafasid to ensure that they're arriving at the correct interpretation of the text. Now, you'll remember at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned something about theology and what the theologians said. And I want to go back to this and talk a little bit more about what the theologians said. So remember, we have this field of kalam, right? And kalam, as the Muslim empire spread, Muslims encountered different philosophies from different civilizations. There was a lot of interaction between Islamic scholarship and Greek philosophy. And they were both proponents and opponents to that interaction. And within those scholars amongst those scholars who were working in the field of kalam, looking at what Greek philosophy says and developing, formulating responses to that, you had these different movements, right? So the Mu'tazila, they're considered a heterodox sect by this Ahl Sunnah. But I want to make a point about that because a lot of times people mistakenly think that means that, Mu'tazila, they have some weird ideas. We don't take what they say seriously. And actually, that's not true. The scholars of Islam, Sunni scholarship, use the works of the Mu'tazila, analyze the works of the Mu'tazila in every single discipline you have in the work, especially in the field of usul al-fiqh. Some of the seminal contributions were made by Mu'tazili scholars, dedicating their lives to ascertaining what are the principles from the scriptural sources that we can use to lay down foundations. And so the historian Ibn Khaldun actually mentions that for Tariqatul Mutakallimun, which is the way of deriving jurisprudence using a theory-based approach, he mentions that four most important works, two of them being works of Mu'tazili scholars, namely Qadi Abdul Jabbar, Abu Hussein al-Basri, in addition to the works of the Ash'ari scholars, Al-Juwayni's Burhan fi Usul al-Fiqh, and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, his work in Usul al-Fiqh. So these four works he mentions as being like the foundational works for Tariqatul Mutakallimun. So any important assessment of the contributions in Islamic theology has to look at the full breadth of Islamic scholarship and the insights that have been made by the various scholars. And that's what our predecessors did. They would take benefit wherever they found it, and analyze the contributions, the positive contributions, even from those whose methodology they disagreed with. So when we talk about this, paradox, this dilemma that we mentioned earlier, Euthyphro's dilemma, it has an interesting relationship to the question of masalih and mafasid. So that question of tahsin wa taqbih, can we know what is good or bad based on reason? The Mu'tazila, they said yes. The Ash'ari said no. So on the theological question, the Mu'tazila said yes, we can use reason, we can be rationalistic to know what is good and what is bad. And the Ash'ari, they said we reason cannot identify what is good or bad independent of revelation. They were textualistic. The interesting thing is when it comes to law, it flips, right? So the Ash'ari, in matters of law, they take into consideration masalih and mafasid, and using reason to identify that, whereas the Mu'tazila do not, right? Or the Mu'tazila narrow the scope of what exactly can be ascertained on the basis of the masalih and the mafasid. And so there's a reason for that paradox, because the Mu'tazila they gave more importance in theology to reason, what happens is that the scope of law was narrowed. And so because reason is already doing so much work, there's less work for the text to do. So when it comes to matters that are determined by the text, they become more textualistic. Whereas the Ash'ari, they expand the scope of law because that if you're saying that reason cannot determine anything independent of revelation, then when you look at revelation, you're going to actually expand the scope of interpretation in being able to identify benefits and harms in the application of scripture as well. So whereas the Mu'tazila would say that maslaha is the believer's reward in the hereafter. It's not something in this life, it's something that applies in the next life as a result, as an outcome of obeying the law. On the other hand, the Ash'ari, they mentioned that no, maslaha is something that you look at in this life as well. And so you find, for example, Imam al-Juwayni, he connects the concept of maslaha with qiyas. And he mentions that how does qiyas work? When you draw an analogy, you have different components of that analogy. So you have the initial case that you're looking at, and you have the ruling on that case. And then you have the illah, the reason for which that ruling applies to that case. And if that same illah is found in another case, then you can apply the same ruling, right? So you have the initial case, you have the ruling on that case, and the reason why that ruling applies to that case. In a new case, if you have the same reason why the ruling would apply, then you would apply the same ruling. So he connects maslaha, universal maslaha, with the concept of illah. If that initial ruling applied to that case because of a maslaha, then you can extend it. So he says, when there is no specific ruling in scripture on a particular matter, the universal maslaha can be used to derive a ruling as long as it does not contradict a specific ruling found in the Sharia. So there's two conditions for the use of maslaha that Imam al-Juwayni mentions. The first is that it has to be an obvious meaning behind a ruling. So you can't read in something mysterious. And the second is that he applied it only in matters of necessity or need. And so he mentions the different categories of, you have the things that are daruri, the necessities, then you have the hajat, the needs, and these are the different categories that, you guys have discussed in detail before. Now, Imam al-Juwayni's student, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the famous scholar, he actually has a very interesting development in his discussion. And what does he mention when he talks about maslaha? He says, we mean by maslaha the preservation of the purpose of the law, maqsud al-shara. And he says the purpose of the law as far as humankind is concerned is, and then he mentions these 5 fundamental maqasid that we're all so familiar with, right? Preservation of religion, life, intellect, progeny, property. So here, when he mentions this he mentions it in connection to maslaha. So this is how he defines maslaha. And he mentions that maslaha that is not based on preserving the aims of the Sharia is null and void. So that goes back to that concept that we mentioned earlier, that when we talk about maslaha, when we talk about benefit, who's assessing that benefit? How are we determining that? It's not going to just be based on somebody coming up with, saying, well, a kid says, well, it's beneficial for me if I want to stay home and play video games all the time. I don't want to go to school. That's my maslaha. And the parent says, no, your maslaha is to go to school and get an education. How you determine the maslaha has to connect back to the aims and objectives of the religious law. And so he also mentions an interesting example of fighting the enemy army in a war, and you're shooting arrows. What do you do if the enemy army starts to use people as human shields? And this is an example that he mentions that's later on taken up by other scholars as well, like Saifuddin al-Amidi and others. So this is an example where they started to look at these scenarios that became very popular amongst philosophers, right? If you know about trolley scenarios, right, where there's a train coming down the train tracks, and what do? Do you divert the train this way or that way? And there's a different outcome based on which track it goes down to. They talked about balancing those masalih and mafasid. So there is this element of looking at these consequences. So it raises an interesting question because if you study ethical theory, there is deontological ethics, right, which is rule-based, and there is teleological ethics, which is based on the consequences, right, based on the overall outcomes. And the amazing thing about the Islamic system is that it actually incorporates the best of both worlds. So we have a deontological system of rules, but we also have a teleological system where we look at the overall consequences related to the maqasid as well. So the rules are not violated, and thrown out the window because of some person's assessment of the consequences. Rather, the rules provide the best way of obtaining and reaching those consequences. So as we're coming to the close of this, I want to mention some take-home messages. So when we talk about masalih and the text, right? We talk about assessment of benefits and harms, and we talk about the text. We need to recognize a few things. We need to realize that there's the idea that there's a conflict between the text and the benefit usually is something that should promote us to think more deeply and to critically evaluate further, because it may be the case that what we think is interpretation of the text. And this is a point that Sheikh Ahmed al-Raisuni mentions. He says, sometimes people have a very rigid interpretation of the text, and that's what's causing the inflexibility and the perceived conflict. And they're not actually taking into account the other texts, fundamental texts that establish the need to eliminate harm or to obtain benefit. And sometimes people have a particular perception of what they think is a benefit, but what they think is a benefit is actually not well established and maybe subject to a lot of conjecture and speculation. Oh, I think this would be more beneficial if this happened, but what's the evidence for that? There may not actually be strong evidence in favor of that. So it means that people have to generally think more closely. So the text, when you examine the text has to have a related implied benefit, and there's usually no real conflict between the text and the benefit. If there is a conflict, then it is between the benefits related to the text and the benefit that is negatively affected by following a text. So it's not actually a case of text versus benefit. It's a case of weighing different benefits, the benefits implied by a particular text and the benefits implied by other texts. And it's a question of which one is more fundamental. So generally, there will always be a neglect in maslaha or missed harm when we stick and follow a different maslaha. And we need to be aware of all the involved benefits and harms and balance between them, and in order to understand which one deserves to be followed or neglected. It's really a matter of weighing benefits and harms, as you guys have discussed in a previous session. So the understanding, the bottom line is that really it's never a case of a text being canceled out, and it's never a case of totally disregarding benefits. What's happening is people usually have a discrepancy in their understanding and evaluation of benefits, and there's usually a discrepancy in their understanding of the texts and how to interpret the text. And so, this is an excellent diagram that Dr. Nuruddin, Brother Muhammad, provided me with that's based on the work of Sheikh Ahmed al-Raisuni, where he mentions that really what we should be doing is, rather than having this competitive approach, exclusionary approach, where it's either the text or the benefit, right? It's this one or that one. They're in competition. That idea that they're in competition and that you either have to throw one out the window or throw the other out the window, that's not actually a sensible way of understanding it. That's not what the religion wants from us. Rather, there's an integrative approach. And he mentions, first of all, that you have to have a tafsir al-maslahi lil-nusus, right? So first, when you look at the text, you understand the text in light of the benefits. And when you draw that interpretation out from the text, you try to understand, well, what was the circumstance behind this ruling to begin with? What is the objective of this ruling? How does it tie into the broader framework of rulings on this particular topic? What are the different masalih and mafasid that Islam wants us to achieve in society based on this ruling? So you have an understanding of the text based on considerations of benefits and harms. And then the other thing is, when you implement the text, there's also consideration of benefits and harms, right? So something could be true in principle, and correct in principle, but when you look at how you implement it, it results in an unintended consequence. And we have examples from the time of the Prophet Muhammad where the Prophet Muhammad said about rebuilding the Kaaba, right? And according to the foundations that Ibrahim had built, and demolishing the existing structure and rebuilding it according to the expanded foundations that Ibrahim had established. He said, were not for the fact that the people are so close to Jahiliyyah, this is what I would have done. So he's considering the situation of the people. So there's a desired course of action, but in light of the situation and the potential harm that they would cause people to see, the Kaaba being demolished and people not being able to understand what is going on, in light of their psychological context, their cultural context, their social context, there are potentially greater harms in pursuing what is otherwise a desirable course of action. And so the course of action is adjusted. And so this diagram, if there's one thing you take away from this presentation, it's going to be this slide and the next slide. So this diagram, the whole point is these two things, maslaha and versus nas, these are not in competition. Rather, we use maslaha in our understanding and implementation of the nas. It's not something that needs to be seen in competition. And this is another, beautiful diagram Brother Muhammad provided me with, which really shows, a lot of times when people talk about maslaha, they're focusing on one dimension. They're not thinking about the different archetypes of the dimension. So for example, somebody says, well, this is maslaha for me on an individual level, but what about the group and the community? Or somebody says, well, this is good for my personal, experience as a human being, but what about my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or this is good for because I'm going to make more money, I'm going to have a bigger house, I'm going to have the materialistic gain. But what about spiritual gain? What's going to actually spiritually benefit the soul? Or this is good because it's going to help people do this and that and everything in this world. What about the hereafter, right? So we have to have a comprehensive understanding of the different dimensions of the masalih and mafasid, where we're not looking at it from the narrow scope of this particular timeline of this worldly existence, where we understand our role as human beings. I'll conclude with this point. Imam al-Raghib al-Asfahani, he mentioned that why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring the human beings into existence? Because of three essential roles. The first is ibadah, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second is imaratul ard, the development and building and constructing positively on this earth. And the third is khilafah, right? Our role as moral custodians on this earth. So we have these roles. And so we understand when we talk salih and mafasid, we're looking at some materialistic perspective. We have to our journey in life and our journey back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I want to say Jazakumullah khairan again to everyone for attending and for listening. And any mistakes that I've made in the presentation are from myself and from shaitan. Whatever is of benefit, is by the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I welcome, any discussion and question and answer. And inshallah, Dr. Nuruddin and Brother Muhammad are going to be participating in the Q&A as well. It's not just, questions for me, inshallah ta'ala.
Well, Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Khan, for giving us some of the dimension of this topic. Indeed, this is a complex topic, and we're sorry that we put you in the middle of it. But it's better you than somebody else. I just want to open, and then for anybody that wanted to intervene, please write a comment, request to speak, or ask a question. I already, as you speaking, there is some interaction happening on the chat. I want to start by pointing to something you mentioned about the importance of scholarship when it comes to assessing the maslaha. This is obviously it's something that is acceptable by everybody, that if you're going to speak in an area, you have to have some expertise in it.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to nawazil and complex issues, to say that expertise in other fields should not get into giving the opinion is a dangerous precedent, because just to cite example, recently, and when the governments all over the world started practicing lockdowns and social distancing, we have famous scholars who have big amount of hifd, both of the Quran and of the Ma'turats and everything, who stood against this. They said, no, we should not close the masjid. Now, if people like you, physicians and people, epidemiologists and government who had the stick and the power of the law did not stop them, they would have created havoc in the communities. I'm reminded of a situation back in the history of one of the ta'uns. The story goes that in the northern Morocco, in the city of Tangier, the Sultan of the time then got a word from Europeans that there is a ship coming from Hajj and it's going to come to Tangier, and he should not let them come out of the ship. Well, he consulted with the ulama, he consulted with the Ahl al-Ra'i, which is the business people in the community. The fact is that in that ship, not only the Hajjis were coming back from Hajj, but also there was some business merchandise coming back, and also some family of Umara, of princes that are traveling back. So there's a lot of complexity in this boat because, so what the business people were putting pressure for their merchandise to be released. Those who have their children and they are people of influence, they want their family to come out of the boat. And the ulama, this is actually the point that where it shows the danger of saying that the opinion should be limited to Islamic scholarship, is that the ulama say, well, this opinion you got is from the kuffar, from European, from the kuffar, and we're not following that. They totally missed that in their history, we have quite a bit practice on how we deal with the ta'un, with pandemics. And so this is we gotta be careful to say that we're gonna create this qati'ah, this division, or you talk on this, I talk on this. Now, of course, I'm not saying that a sheikh will practice medicine or a physician will give fatwa. But what I'm saying is that everybody who is intellectual, who has the ability to bring something on the table, should be participating. I think we have many examples of this dangerous precedent to say that.
Yes.
We hear a lot this, oh, you shouldn't talk about this because you have no business talking about Islamic knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I can mention many examples of my own as well. We're as we have a group of physicians, Muslim Medical Association of Canada, and we work with the Canadian Council of Imams. We have a group of physicians as well who provide consultation for some of the Muslim scholars in North America, American Muslim Jurist Assembly. And this is the approach that we need, an interdisciplinary approach, because this is what Islam teaches us. You need to, al-hukm far'un an tasawwuri, right? You cannot pass a ruling on something without knowing the situation. So it as you mentioned, it does a lot of danger when people are expert in one field and they assume that that's that gives them the ability to suddenly assess everything else. And most of the problems that we're dealing with in today's time are actually problems that are interdisciplinary, right? Whether it's something about economics, whether it's something about psychology, about counseling somebody with suicidal thoughts or mental health conditions, whether it's about matters of the pandemic and to speaking to epidemiologists, you need to have an interdisciplinary approach. So rather than saying that this is something for only these scholars or those scholars, what I'm pointing to is the fact that we need to expand our understanding of scholarship to begin with and have an interdisciplinary approach to scholarship. And one of the things that we do, unfortunately, is we assume that there are certain things that are Islamic sciences and everything else is worldly sciences. But what Islam teaches us is that there are ayat al-kawniyah and ayat al-Qur'aniyah, right? So even what people call quote unquote worldly sciences, studying medicine, for example, this is actually an Islamic science as well. And so this is something that we need to take into consideration. So I agree 100% with that point.
Jazakallah khair. Any comment from the audience, questions? I know that there was some comments on the chat. Mustafa or Muhammad, would you care to share some of your comments there?
Sure. If Mustafa doesn't go, I will go. Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. No, just I want just to emphasize a couple of maybe points, and then thank you so much, Dr. Nazir, for the presentation and trying to bring many items that at one point may be conceived as contradictory. That's what I want to try to wrap up here, and by emphasizing the religious perspective in order to avoid the hawa, or to avoid the desire, or in order to avoid the human drive to target maslaha, we may miss the stick by not looking at the maslaha as a whole. And what I mean by that, a maslaha as a whole is an open system. You already mentioned it, just the fact that you are telling a lot of, going through a lot of items, it may appear at some point that it was kind of contradictory. That's what I'm trying to handle, at least in small point here. So as maslaha is an open system, and you just mentioned that there is al-kitab al-manshur and kitab al-mastur, or this universe kind of world of knowledge and experience and growth, that it doesn't even end. This is the kalimatullah al-manshura, or you cannot find the end of this wisdom in the Allah creation and the Allah wisdom in the book. So if you go into the level of tackling the wisdom, you cannot limit it as a hand. And this is why you mentioned at one point that maybe Ash'ari and Mu'tazila, they were appearing at one level in the opposite side, but in it comes to the implementation, they are appearing in the opposite side. Otherwise, they will not appear kind of suitable and convenient for the people. They will, one of them is like it's already kind of disappearing, but even Mu'tazila disappeared by word or by name, it's still there in our conscience, our human drive of rationality, and we cannot live without it. And this is our Mu'tazila component here ourselves. So without denying it, I'm talking about this maslaha as open system. So, and you highlighted it when you were concluding that this is how we can tell that the maslaha is Islamic when it's open. This is how we can tell that maslaha is not exclusionary when it's open. When maslaha it's only derived by a nas and only derived by Islamic scholar, it's exclusionary. It's already exclusionary by essence. When it's going beyond the Islamic scholar and it's going beyond the appearance of the text, now it's not exclusionary. Now it's inclusive. Now we start talking about multidisciplinary. Now we start talking about the human as experience, not the Muslim as experience, and so on. So the material cannot fulfill itself unless if it reaches the spirituality. And the spirituality cannot fulfill itself unless if it reaches the material. And this dimension of the archetypes that you mentioned in the end that make the maslaha Islamic. The maslaha Islamic, it doesn't look at the narrow side of the material unless if it starts looking how it could be extended to bring the litma'inan. It's like which is the spiritual side of it, and it's like this spiritual drive bring more material benefit to it in order to make it Islamic. And the same thing for the hereafter and this life, and the same thing for the individual and the group. It's like, it's not because there are two different poles. It's like, it's because the individual benefit cannot be achieved unless if there is strong group. And the strong group cannot be even beneficial unless if there is empowered individual and fulfilled individual and kind of benefit for the individuals. And this is the complexity of the kind of little bit humanistic approach of the maslaha. We call it as, alhamdulillah, all the human beings start looking at it as not only narrow kind of maslaha. Even now neuroscientists and the psychologists, when it comes to the shadow, how you can get your freedom beyond your shadow, is like you need to tackle and you face yourself in order to go beyond and to free yourself. And to free yourself is just to gain more benefits on that. Just I don't want to maybe to go a little bit more, but that was very interesting. It may appear at some point that something is contradictory, but I hear you. I already have discussion with you know beyond that. But just for the clarity of the recording, I want to bring these two words there. Maybe it helps to bring some balance. Thank you.
Yeah, I just to reiterate what you just mentioned, I really like the point Brother Muhammad mentioned, that we don't see these things as exclusionary, right? It's not a question of, oh, we're either benefiting the individual or the group, right? It's the individual's benefit really comes about through the group. The human benefit comes about through following cultivating a relationship with the divine as well. So it's not a question of seeing things in competition, right? Either we're benefiting just the religion of Islam or human beings. Really, it has to be our duty, our divine duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one of taking care of His creation as well, right? This is there's an article that I've written on Yaqeen Institute called Divine Duty, Islam and Social Justice, that specifically talks about the principles that the Islamic faith teaches us about social justice and our responsibility towards our fellow creatures on this earth. It has to be something that we take into consideration.
Jazakallah khairan. Dr. Qanduz.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khairan. I'm gonna try to explain my what I want to say as clearly as I could, so that I don't get misunderstood. I think I'm often something you said caught my attention. You said that maslaha is primarily, in essence, is primarily what benefits the belief or religion of Islam. So by strengthening people's religiosity, and that to me sounded like a closed system. So you have that wheel, that archetype of maslaha dimensions. Okay, it's different dimensions, spiritual, material, it's individual, group, etc. But it's all within the Islamic circle. So yes, it's open within the system. It has opposites, all of that, all those aspects, those dimensions. But once you're outside, it looks, at least from what I heard, it looks closed. Because what would happen if there is a human being's interest, maslaha, that's not necessarily within the guidelines of Islam, at least the most obvious ones. So what then? So it's almost like we are in that the same mindset, basically, that some would take to the extremes. They would take to the extreme, and I would say, oh, this will benefit Islam if we restrict those rights, if we do this, if we do that, this discourse that justifies it. So I'm caricaturing here. I'm taking things to the extreme. But unless it's an open system to the humanity, to the maslaha of humanity, rather than the maslaha of deen, of religion, then it can go to directions that are not really good, in my opinion. I don't know if that's clear enough or not.
Yeah, I think it's the point and the question is very clear. Jazakallah khair. We mentioned the point of Imam Raghib al-Asfahani, right? Where he mentioned that there's three purposes for which the human being has been created. When he talks about imaratul ard, right, developing and building on this earth, who is benefiting from this? Is it just meant to benefit the Muslims? No. When he talks about khilafah, the moral custodianship of the human beings, Who's benefiting from this? Just the Muslims? No, absolutely not. When the Prophet Muhammad said, as reported in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah, تَصَدَّقُوا عَلَى أَهْلِ الْأَدْيَانِ كُلِّهَا تَصَدَّقُوا عَلَى أَهْلِ الْأَدْيَانِ كُلِّهَا. Donate in charity to people of all religious backgrounds. Right? Is this something?
That's charity. Yeah.
Yeah. So is this something specific to Muslims? No. And the sadaqah is something, by the way, the Islamic understanding of sadaqah is so expansive as well. Right? It's not just money. A smile in the face of your brother is a sadaqah. Removing, a harmful thing from the road is an act of charity. Every way and means that we can take to benefit humanity. And there's another narration in Musnad of Imam Ahmad. لا يبلغ العبد حقيقة الإيمان حتى يحب للناس ما يحب لنفسه من الخير. That a worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only reaches the reality of faith and iman. So here's the spiritual dimension, but then where's the moral dimension comes next, right? حتى يحب للناس ما يحب لنفسه من الخير. Until he loves for all humanity, and nas, right? It's not restricted. The same goodness that he loves for himself, he loves for all humanity. When the Quran mentions وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ الْجُنُبِ, right? The neighbor who is close by, the neighbor who is next door. What is being referred to here? It's one of the tafasir is that this is both the person within your faith community and outside your faith community as well. There's the understanding and the tradition should never be that our goodwill or the benefit, the masalah that we're talking about is a closed system only to benefit Muslims. No, it has to be about benefiting all of humanity. And that's why it's absolutely an essential point that you mentioned. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you.
One sentence,
Please.
Just should be reflected in the general discourse, and that's something I see is still closed, at least in the discourse. We might share all those things, but even if you use the terms charity and being beneficent to the others, it's still within the religious lingo. It's still within the Islamic system. So at least when it comes to the global discourse, we should be open to integrating some other dimensions.
We have to be, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about these terms, these are so we understand our own nusus and the masalih contained in the nusus. But how do we translate that into the real world? That is another question, right? What is the terminology that we use? The istilah, right? That we use. It's going to be translating it into the discourse of the contemporary discourse that we're talking about, whether it's the discourse of human rights, the discourse of social justice. These are the things that are not partisan to only Muslims, but this is something that we've written about, right? Islam and social justice. How do we translate our principles and concepts into this discourse as well?
Please let us know if you want to make a comment. While we're waiting for other people to write their question or comment, I wanted to ask Dr. Nazir, and we talked about this back when you were in Calgary. I wanted to see how would we seek from the fitrah in empowering us to assess the maslaha when it seems to be conflicting with the text?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Nuruddin. And it's something that needs further research as well. I think it's a great topic for further research. I think there's a few things we can say. One thing that's interesting is, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, right? وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. When you're enjoining ma'roof is that which people already recognize. They know that there's goodness in it from their fitrah. And munkar is something that's unfamiliar to people. Their fitrah already denounces it. So the believers are not calling people to something that is, totally unfamiliar to them. It's what we're promoting in society are fundamentally goods and values that a person recognizes from the fitrah. And we have a lot of developmental psychology about this. So, they do developmental psychology experiments on children as young as 3 years old. And if you have a toddler in the family, you know exactly what this is referring to. When you when you give candies to different children, or even you ask a child to divide up candies amongst their stuffed animals. and they have a preference to give the equal number to everyone. Right? There's a natural inherent predisposition towards justice. And if you give extra to one person, you don't give it to the other person, then what is the child, one of the first things the child learns how to say is, that's not fair. Right? That's not fair. It's an inherent thing that they understand the concept of justice. And they've done experiments where if you have one puppet that's nice to another puppet, but the other puppet is mean, and then you ask the child, okay, which of the two do you want to give the candy to? The children give the candy to the puppet that plays nice. Some of them will even take the candy away from the puppet that's mean. And some of them will even punch the puppet on the head that's mean, right? So they have this inherent understanding. There's a sense of justice there. Also, the sense of compassion, right? Children as young as 3 years old will soothe somebody that they see in distress. So that instinct for rahmah is there, and it tends to be girls do this more than boys. So girls have a more that fitri disposition comes more readily for rahmah. And so this is something that we see there. So when there's a question about assessing the masalih and mafasid from a fitri perspective, I think the fitrah gives us these broad guidelines that we're not going to come up with a maslaha that contradicts the moral sensibilities that we get from our fitrah. We're not going to come up with something that is going to run contrary to our fitrah. We know that if somebody is being oppressed, right? If there is if we're talking about racism, for example, racial discrimination, and what can we as Muslims do to stand up against racial discrimination? This is something that's clear from the fitrah, right? You don't need any extra dalil, aqli, naqli, anything. This is from the fitrah. A human being knows that this is something that is unjust. It's something that societal perversions cause to change and allow people to accept that. But all you do is just show it to a child, this idea of treating somebody with discrimination is something that the fitrah brings about.
There's a follow-up there. When we some of the examples that we see in this chapter, and we see how the Prophet ﷺ is giving us a training on how to practice looking at the maslaha versus the pre-established text. The example when he told Aisha, Ya Aisha, لولا أن قومك حديث عهد بالجاهلية. He actually left a thing that is part of the deen, a Kaaba.
Yes.
That's where that's part of the 5 pillars of Hajj.
Yeah.
He left that because he's considering some aspect of the fitna that could be caused to the people of Quraysh that are new to Islam. And so how do we now, granted he's the prophet and he is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but these are not in vain. These are for us to get a workshop on practicing that and on getting detached from when our fitrah is telling us that the benefit is there. There's a problem in the understanding of this text. There's a problem of understanding either the Arabic meaning of it, which is the very first level where people go astray is when they don't understand the Arabic meaning of the text, and the maqsad of the meaning of the text and the context. And we have to actually keep going back when we see some injustice, like you say. The Christian have made this as part of that slavery is their right from the Bible and from Christianity. And so religiously, they were promoting this social injustice, this criminal act of slavery and racism that they propagated. And I wanted to actually draw Muhammad in this conversation. Muhammad, how does the Al-Mujadala story قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها fit in this discussion?
Yeah, just I want to mention 2 things here, and I will decouple myself from the historical fact of discriminatory and the slavery. I will get back to that because it's not a happy point even for the Muslims. We're not talking about the Christian here. talking about the Muslim people here. But let's talk about the Mujadala, for example. The Mujadala has come in as human experience, and this is why it's open. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened the book in order to look for the human essence of the maslaha. This is why the Dr. Nazir kind of mentioned the Tamuruna bil Ma'ruf wa Tanhawna 'anil Munkar, which is what is recognizable, which is preferable, what is makes sense to the people, because the fitra without rationality and without feeling, you cannot recognize it, and this is where it can becomes cumbersome. It's not helpful. When fitra is not helpful, when you miss the rational part and you miss the feeling part. And you cannot look at the fitra without the rationality and the feeling part of it. Maybe Brother Nazir has more thought about it because he wrote kind of article on it. But I would like to mention that. And this is what push Khawla bint Tha'laba in her situation, when the feeling doesn't make sense and her rationality doesn't make sense, when her feeling hurt her and the rationality doesn't make sense to her. This is how she expressed the fitra. The fitra, something is embedded, could be expressed by feeling and by rationality. When she is coming to the Prophet, she's not coming happy, she's not coming neutral, she's coming unhappy. And she was kind of not talking to him, she was arguing to him. And this is good position. Arguing and talking is two levels. And when Khawla, which was coming to the Prophet, she was not happy and it doesn't make sense to her, she's pushing really back against the Prophet and going beyond his authority to ask for the help of Allah. And this is where we see the extreme. And this is how we can behave as a human being before to be a Muslim against the authority of the scholars, the authority of the understanding, and the authority of somebody is coming with no sense or something that hurt us as a feeling. And this is kind of the power that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give to the lay people back to the people that they have authority, which is the Prophet here. And we want just to understand this dilemma. This dynamic is really extreme here as human experience, and we don't want to just to kind of shut it down. Just to add one element here, the Prophet ﷺ, as he was looking at the human as a vast and as open system, he said at one in his position, which we want it to be structurally embedded, as per Mustafa Qandus, how we can make it structurally embedded. لو دعيت إلى حلف كان يدعى في الجاهلية للبيت. So if I was called to a group of people that they are looking for the benefit for everybody, I will accept and I will go back there. It's not because it's a Muslim. It's not because it's coming from the divine. It's not because it's coming from some level of spirituality. It's because it's meeting me as human experience that I was dealing with the injustice, meeting my feeling when I was looking at the other tribes dealing with the injustice. And this is my human before to be a Muslim. And this is the Prophet is talking about his human aspect there. He's talking about his rationality as human and his feeling as human. And he was just to belong to that group that he was for that cause, regardless if it's coming from divine or not. With I don't want to make it that bad, but I want just to make it as structurally embedded in the way we are looking and they're freezing and framing our thought when it comes to the maslaha.
Muhammad, definitely Christianity does not have.
I missed this point. I missed that one. Do you think Muslim, maybe as a thought and as the books, they put some thought for the slavery government until last century? They were living on the business of slavery. It just hurt us as a Muslim, as human. As a human, it doesn't make me feel comfortable at all. It's like, why 14 centuries and we cannot make a decision? Really, we are waiting for other experience to happen and to force us as a Muslim to make that call? Is it really that's the message? How we can really deal with it? It doesn't make us proud at all. We are in the worst example when it comes to slavery and discrimination and stuff. Just I'm getting sick for the people talking about the Black lives and stuff, and we have embedded kind of discriminatory thought in our books, the way we talk about the hijab and the slave woman, the way we embed it as a structure, peace, a structure in the religious text. It's really a shame to the human thought when they were when we. It's not they. Maybe they were justified in their anthropological condition, but when we still as a voice for them, it's like we cannot even stop ourselves. It's like that's my. Sorry about that.
No, that's a good point. There's nothing to defend there. And it's not the topic of the day, but it is the topic of the hour, the whole Black Lives Matter, and one of the focus that we as Arab, as Pakistani, as others, right, who are not, who are coming from different parts of the world, we have a big problem with prejudice in our own cultures, and in addition to the religious aspect that Muhammad talks about, that is also deeply in us. And we think that I'm not racist. I have Black friends or something, as some people would say. But I mean, I think this is a time where we should all reflect on ourselves, on our own families and extended families, and be part of the solution and speak out about this, and educate ourselves more. But did you have a comment, more comment on the fitra question there?
No, actually, it was just a point about the fitra, and because I hear that a lot, and so basically, yeah, fitra get distorted with the community that we live in, because depending on the community habits and values, it would affect the fitra as we grow up, right? And so really assessing maslaha on fitra alone is really, I don't think it's right, in the absence of logic, intellect, values, and even the script, of course, all together. So yeah, nothing much really.
Naam, Jazakallah khairan. I mean, when in the scenarios that you posed, Dr. Khan, in the beginning, I know those were not meant for us to give opinion on those, but just to stimulate the discussion. And sometimes we get stuck when the premise is wrong to start with. Then we are struggling with a conflict that doesn't exist to start with. So it's very important, as Dr. Ahmed Raisuni was saying somewhere in one of the write-up there, that first we have to make sure that the text is saying what we think is saying, right? So, like, for example, the question of the music versus fundraising, well, there is zero consensus on this in this question. If you read many scholars, now some scholars are in the position that is haram, but by no means this question has consensus. So if we start with the assumption there is a consensus on the non-permissibility of music, this we're getting ourselves in a situation where, so first we have to clarify that this is a true benefit, and this is a true text and teaching on that matter before we try to marry the two, if you know what I mean there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any last question? I think we are in a good place here. We made up for the last time that we usually give people together. This was very dynamic, very lively session, Dr. Khan. We really appreciate your time here. Nobody has the answers, but we're here to learn from each other and to have this open dialogue. And that is the nature of this series, is for us to challenge each other and keep moving forward. We're getting close to the end of the series. Next week we will be doing the synthesis, and the week after we will be doing the conclusion. And so we're still looking for all of your contribution. On Thursday, we will have the case, the pandemic case of the week. We haven't formulated yet, so we'll be sending it to you by email. We're still thinking about it. So Mohammed and I and Dr. Nazir were bouncing, and Dr. Kanduz, we were bouncing some ideas. But feel free to make your suggestion. We haven't made our mind finally about it, but we'll have one, inshallah, soon sent to you, hopefully by tomorrow. Jazakumullah khairan, and Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Nazir. Really appreciate your time, and good to see you again, inshallah. So we'll hopefully see you on Thursday, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, everyone, for coming and for the lively participation as well. Alhamdulillah, it's an honor and benefit to be in such a group of of colleagues to discuss these topics. Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.